Hello and welcome to Beaducation.com. My name is Colin Mahler. We are here to do the crystal elf weave today. The elf weave is a box style chain, and we are making it with a large enough ring that we can actually weave in 3mm bicone Swarovski crystals, which gives it a little bit of color and bling. I highly recommend that you go through and watch this entire video before you start the class so that you know what you're getting into and where you're going to be going with this. So yeah, have a good time. Pick out those crystal colors before you start, and let's get started. The tools you will need today to make your crystal elf weave bracelet are one pair of bent chain nose pliers, one pair of chain nose pliers. Both of these pliers we'll be using to manipulate our jump rings and make our chain. We will also be using our chain nose pliers to flat crimp our crimp beads. You will also need one pair of cutters. I will be using these cutters. These are a pair of Tronix flush cutters. I will be using these to cut my beading wire. Whatever you normally use to cut your beading wire, go ahead and get those out. The materials you will be using today to make your crystal elf weave bracelet are 18 gauge jump rings. These are 4.5mm inner diameter. They are sterling silver. We will be using oxidized jump rings today to make it easier to see on camera. If you do buy the kit for this class, they will be bright sterling silver. And you will need about 150 of them to complete your bracelet. You'll need a piece of 18 gauge wire. This is just a plain piece of copper wire. You'll be using 3mm bicone Swarovski crystals, and you'll need about 40 to 50 of them depending on how long your bracelet is. You'll need a clasp. I'm going to be using just a simple box clasp today. You can also use a toggle clasp, and if you're buying the kit for this class, you will get a plain silver toggle clasp with the kit. You'll need about a foot of fine beading wire. This is a stainless steel nylon coated wire used in beading. You will need two crimp beads. These are 2 by 1mm crimp beads. You can also use 2 by 2mm crimp beads if you don't have the 2 by 1s handy. And 2 paper clips to hold the ends of our chain. The first thing you're going to need to do is close about 40 of your jump rings, and you will be opening the rest. This is an intermediate project, so you should already know how to properly open and close your jump rings, but I will do a quick review. So to close your jump rings, my bent chain nose pliers are in my left hand and my chain nose pliers are in my right hand. I'm going to stabilize my ring in my bent chain nose pliers with the opening up at the 12 o'clock position. And I'm going to grab the other side of my jump ring with my chain nose pliers, and I'm going to rock both ends back past the point where they meet and back again. Now what I'm doing here is trying to close that little gap in between the two ends, which I just did. That little click means that the two ends just hit each other, which means I'll have a nice flush closing. And I'm just going to wiggle the ends until they line up nicely, like so. So I am stabilizing my jump ring in my bent chain nose pliers. The opening of the jump ring is up at the 12 o'clock position. I'm going to grab the other side of the jump ring with my chain nose pliers, and I'm going to rock both ends back past the point where they meet. Back again. What I'm trying to do here is close up the gap between the two ends of the jump ring. And that little tiny click right there was the two ends hitting past each other. There it is again. And now I'm just going to wiggle the two ends until I get them to line up nicely and get a nice flush closing, just like that. Once you've closed your 40 jump rings, you're going to go ahead and open the rest of your jump rings. Once again, you're going to stabilize your jump ring in your bent chain nose pliers with the opening up at the 12 o'clock position. Grab the other side with your chain nose pliers and just give it a twist, about 1/4 of a twist away from you. Get those nice and open. Now we're going to get in really close here. Once again, I'm stabilizing my jump ring in my bent chain nose pliers, The opening is up at the 12 o'clock position. I'm going to grab the other side of my jump ring with my chain nose pliers, and I'm just going to give it about a quarter of a twist away from me. And get your jump rings nice and open, just like that. Next step is going to be to create what's called a 1-in-1 chain, which is just a length of chain that is one jump ring attached to one jump ring attached to one jump ring, which you will see in just a moment. And we're going to start doing that by creating little 3-ring units and then connecting those all together. So you're going to start with a single open jump ring, and you're going to take 2 of your closed jump rings and link them onto this open jump ring, and go ahead and close this up. So now you have this little section of chain, very simple chain. And you're going to go ahead and do this for all of your closed jump rings. Now that you have all your little three ring sections put together, we're going to start linking all of these together to make one long length of chain. So you're going to take an open jump ring and link the end ring on 2 of these sections onto this open jump ring. Go ahead and close that up. Like so. And take another open jump ring, link that through either end of this piece of chain, and add another little section onto that, and close this jump ring. And you're going to continue linking all your little sections of chain together until you end up with a length of chain that is twice the length of what you want your finished chain to be, plus an inch. So my bracelets, I wear about a 7-inch bracelet. The clasp I am using is about 1 inch long. So I'm going to need about 13 inches of this chain. And once again, I wear a 7-inch bracelet. My clasp takes about 1 inch. And so I will need about 6 inches of chain. I'm going to double that. That gives me 12 inches, plus add an extra inch. That will give me the 13 inches of chain. Okay, so now I have finished putting together my 1-in-1 chain, and I have a tiny bit over 13 inches of chain. This length of chain does not have to be exact. This chain is very easy to adjust the length of at the very end, even after you are almost finished constructing it. So let's move on to our next step. Now you're going to take your chain and you're going to grab either end and find the approximate center ring. Again, if it's not exact, don't worry about it. And once you've found that ring, you're going to go ahead and hook your paper clip into it. Make sure you hook it all the way on so it doesn't just fall right off. So now we are ready to start constructing our chain, and this is a box chain, or it will be when we're done. We are going to ignore this very first ring that is attached to the paper clip, and our first jump ring that we're going to be linking will be going through the first 2 pairs of jump rings down from the paper clip. So I want these first 2 jump rings, this first pair of jump rings, to sit together. I want them to be touching. And the next pair of jump rings I want to sandwich outside of the first pair. So the first pair of jump rings should be touching, and the second pair of jump rings should sit to the outside. Can you see that? So this is our first pair of jump rings. It's basically the meat in our sandwich, and this second pair of jump rings is our bread. Oops. Turn those around so they, again, that they sit to the outside of the first pair. Like so. As opposed to, sometimes these jump rings will get turned around. If you look at it and it looks like this and you have one of these jump rings sitting between the first pair, you want to turn it around so that it sits outside. I'm going to use a copper wire to kind of guide, use this copper wire as a guide to where my first jump ring will go. Now my first jump ring is going to link through all 4 of these rings, and there's a common space between all 4 of them. So I'm going to start going through the outside, link through the 2 inner jump rings and come back out through my second outer ring, like so. And if you need to, you can leave your wire here. If you're using a wire as a guide, you can leave that in there. There is enough space to get your jump ring through there, and then take the wire out. I'm going to go ahead and take my wire out now and put my first jump ring in. I'm going to pick up my jump ring with my chain nose pliers. To rearrange my rings again. Okay. And I'm going to hold my jump ring at one end of the jump ring as opposed to picking it up right in the middle. And I'm going to go through, once again, the common space through all 4 of those jump rings, like so. It's a little hard to see. Once you get that through, you're going to go ahead and close that jump ring up. And once you get this closed, this jump ring doesn't necessarily want to behave the way it's supposed to. So I'm going to take my finger and I'm just going to push it up towards my paper clip, because that is where it's supposed to be. So you're going to have to position that first ring. So here's our first jump ring that we just added in. Now this is a box chain. It does have 4 sides. It has a top, a bottom, which we will flip back and forth between, and 2 sides, which will develop as we go along. So now that I have my first jump ring in, I'm going to flip the chain over to the other side. And what I'm looking for on this side is these 2 rings right here that are sort of tilted in towards each other and touching. Those will be the meat in my next sandwich that I'm going to make here. So I want those 2 rings to be touching. The next 2 rings down will sit to the outside. And again, make sure that they're sitting to the outside. Sometimes this ring will flip and want to sit in between that pair. You want to make sure that it's not sitting in between like that, otherwise your chain will not work. So flip it, both those rings, so they sit to the outside. Once again, I'm going to use my wire as a guide to show you where the path is that your next jump ring is going to go. So I'm going through all 4 of these rings here, through the common space between all 4 of them. Make sure that you get through all 4 of these rings. If you miss a ring, you're going to have to go back and fix it, and it's easiest to do that when you see it right away. If you miss a ring and you get down to the end of your chain, it's a little trickier to fix it once your chain is completed. So anytime you find a mistake in your chain, try and fix it as soon as possible. So once again, you can leave your wire in there as a guide because you do have enough room to get your jump ring in there with the wire. I'm going to take my wire out and put my next jump ring in. Again, pick up your jump ring at one end and link through all 4. Oops, shoot. So get that jump ring through all 4 of those rings, like so. And then go ahead and close it up. And if it needs a little help, go ahead and push that ring up towards your paper clip. So I want to get in really close here so you get a really good look at what's going on. This is the ring that I just added, and again it's going through, let's see if I can, it's going through these, these 2 rings here and these 2 rings here. And just make sure that the farther out pair of rings are sitting to the outside of the closer in pair of rings. Closer in meaning closer to the paper clip. And this ring should be pointed up towards your paper clip. So here is that last ring that we added. And we're going to be flipping back and forth from side to side, adding these rings. So our next ring is going to go onto the other side of the chain. And once again, what we're looking for are these 2 rings that are tilted together, touching each other. And also I want you to take a look at the side of this chain. At these rings that we are adding are going to start to create sort of a herringbone pattern on the sides of the chain. And if you lose your place, if you drop your chain or you put it down and walk away and come back and you cannot for the life of you remember what side of the chain that you are on, one of the clues will be to look at the pattern from the side, and the ring that is lowest down on your chain, that's the last ring that you added. You know that now that you need to come to the other side of the chain to add your next ring. The other clue to look for will be, you're going to be holding your chain taut so that you can find these 2 rings that are touching each other here. On this side of the chain where we just added our ring, you're not going to have those 2 rings tilted towards each other, touching each other. But on the side where we're ready to add our next ring, you will see these 2 rings that are tilted in towards each other and touching. So now we're going to add our next ring. And we're using the same, this is the same technique, the same method we've been using. I'm going to make sure that these 2 rings here are touching, and the next pair down should sit to the outside of those rings. I'm going to pick up my next open jump ring with my chain nose pliers. And I'm going to link through the common space through all 4 of those rings. Like so, and close it up. And once again, here's the side of our chain. Here's the last ring we added. We know now that we need to come over to this side, and lo and behold, there are our 2 rings that are sitting, touching each other. Add one more ring here on this side. There you go, get it linked through all 4 of those rings, and again, make sure you get through all 4 rings. One of the most common mistakes on this chain is to only link through 3 of the rings, so before you close your jump ring up, make sure you've got all 4 rings hooked onto it. And give that a little push so that it's facing up towards your paper clip. And you're going to continue doing this all the way down the length of your 1-in-1 chain. So here we are, almost to the end of our chain. La la la. See both sides. Now you can make this chain in the jump ring size that we're working with today. This chain doesn't really hold its shape very well. It gets a little bit floppy, which is where the crystals come in because they help this chain to hold its pattern, hold its shape. If you wanted to make a crystal elf weave or an elf weave chain without any crystals in it, you could go ahead and use an 18 gauge jump ring with a 4mm inner diameter, and it will hold its shape a little bit better than these 4.5mm jump rings. So here we are at the end of the chain, or close to the end, and when I folded my chain in half, I ended up with one extra link on the end on one side than I did on the other. And what you're going to do is, first of all, you kind of want to take a measurement of your chain at this point on your wrist and see about where it sits. Make sure that you're not making it too long or too short. Oops, can you see this? And it looks like I should have it just about right by the time I get to the end. So I'm not going to add on another ring. I'm actually going to take this extra ring off. And if you decide that it looks like it might be a little bit short, go ahead and just add an extra ring onto the short side of the chain. But I'm going to take this extra ring off of the longer side of the chain just to even things out. And I'm just going to continue. I have a couple more rings to add here till I get to the very end. I need to be working on this side. And I'm pretty much going to add these rings until I cannot do it anymore. Oops. And this here will be the last ring that I add. Oops, and we got a little something caught up in there. Oh, look, I got an extra ring trapped up in that last ring that I added. So I'm gonna open this ring back up. And remove that extra ring. Hopefully I got the right one, which I did. Close that ring back up again. Nope, something has gone horribly awry. I'm going to take this ring out entirely. Do that over again. Okay, there we go. Now I'm going to close this ring up. Okay. Now I'm going to flip back to the other side and put my final ring in. There we go. Close it up. grab onto those two end rings and push that ring into place. And I'm just going to attach it through these last two jump rings on the end of the chain. Okay, so I just want to talk about that little goof up I had on adding this ring right here. And what had happened was when I added this ring, one of these end rings that had kind of flipped up and gotten hooked onto the ring that I was adding, which I didn't notice until I had already closed this ring. But once I had closed it up, I realized that I had something a little weird going on. And if you make a mistake, if you miss linking through a ring or you link through an extra ring, you're probably going to see the difference in your chain immediately. So what had happened again is that one of these little end rings flipped up and got hooked into this ring right here, and all I did was undo that ring. If you make a mistake, don't panic. Just undo the ring you did. If you need to, take it out and put it back in again. It's no big deal. But as you're working your way down the chain, you can grab both the very end of your chain and kind of give it a little tug once you get this ring linked through, or even before, and it will kind of settle everything into place. And the other thing I wanted to mention is if you miss going through a ring and you only go through 3 of the 4 rings that you're supposed to be going to, one of these rings somewhere will kind of stick out further to the side, and again, you should see that pretty immediately. Again, don't panic, take a deep breath, go back, undo the ring where the mistake is, and put it back in where it belongs. If you find a mistake that's a little bit further up the chain, you may need to undo on both sides, undo these rings that you've added all the way up to your mistake. Deep sigh, I know. Nobody likes doing that, but sometimes you have to. Sometimes it's easier just to undo what you've done up to the point where the mistake was made and then work your way back down. Okay, so I have completed, or almost completed, my chain here, and I'm going to take a measurement before I move on. You need to have your clasp picked out before you add your crystals, because once you add the crystals, you cannot change the length of your chain. It's set once the crystals are in. So I have, my chain is about 6 inches, actually almost exactly 6 inches, plus my clasp, which measures about 1 inch, and again I wear a 7-inch bracelet. However, I need to will be adding 1 more ring on the very end of this chain, plus because the loops on my clasp, turn that around so you can see it a little better, are going the same direction as the rings on the end of my chain, I'm going to have to add a ring to attach the clasp with. So that's going to add a little bit of extra length as well. So what I'm going to do here is go ahead and shorten my chain just a tiny little bit so it doesn't end up being too long. If you need to, you can actually go ahead and attach your clasp. This I started with the white paper clip. This is the beginning of my chain. You're going to attach your clasp to this ring on the very end of the chain here, and so if you need to go ahead and get a really accurate measurement, you can go ahead and attach your clasp to this end ring, and I will go ahead and do that really quick. So this is the beginning end of my chain, and my clasp will be attached to this single ring on the very end of the chain. And I'm going to get a good accurate measurement of my chain with the clasp on. So I'm going to undo my paper clip right now. And I'm going to take a smaller jump ring to attach my clasp with. I forgot to oxidize these smaller ones, so they're very shiny and they will provide a nice contrast for you to be able to see what I'm doing here. So I'm going to go ahead and hook this little jump ring into the end of my chain and attach my clasp to it. And close up that jump ring. Now I'm just mocking this up when I am actually attaching my clasp to the chain. I have enough room on the loop of my clasp to add 2 jump rings to attach the clasp with. Anytime that you can fit 2 jump rings through the loop of your clasp, I highly recommend that you do so. It just adds a little bit more strength and stability to these ends of the chain that get a lot of wear and tear, because that is in fact where the clasp is. Okay, so now with my clasp attached to the chain, I do come to exactly 7 inches. However, once again, I will need to add one more jump ring to the very end of this chain to finish it off, and plus an extra jump ring to actually attach the other side of the clasp. So my chain is going to end up being a tiny bit too long, so I'm going to undo one little section here to shorten my chain up. So I'm going to undo, I'm going to take my clasp off, put the paper clip back on. Okay, so here I am at the finish, the end of my chain as opposed to the beginning end of my chain. And I want to take off a little bit of length here because again, once I add my clasp, the chain will be a little too long for me. I'm going to undo this paper clip. Conversely, if your chain is a little bit too short, all you need to do is start adding, adding onto the length of this chain. So I'll lengthen it first and then I will go ahead and shorten it up. And you can just do this one jump ring at a time. You don't have to make little units like you did in the beginning. So I'm just going to start adding single jump rings to either side of the chain just to make it a little bit longer. And as you're going along, this chain again is a little bit floppy because of the size of the jump rings, and these rings that we've been adding have a tendency to want to flip in the wrong direction. If that starts happening, just take your finger and run it down the length of the chain to settle them all down. And again, all these rings should be pointing towards the paper clip you started with. So here I've added a little bit more length, and I can go ahead and some tension in the end of that chain so I can kind of see what I'm doing. There are my 2 jump rings that are tilted in towards each other, and then I can go ahead and add an extra ring. Close that up. Oops. So there I've just added a tiny bit more length to the end of my chain, which is actually not at all what I wanted to do, but I wanted to show you how to do that. So now I'm going to undo some of the length of my chain, and I want to back up a couple of links just so that my bracelet doesn't end up being too long. So I'm just going to undo what I just did. And I'm going to come back here, flip it over. And of course, if you have any rings that you need to undo, it will probably be the one that you closed the best and have the worst time finding the seam in. Sort of the Murphy's Law of chain making. Okay, so now I've backed it up a little bit, and I'm just going to go ahead and remove these links that are dangling off the end. Don't need those anymore. All right. Oops. So now I need to find those. There we go. The 2 rings on the very, very end of the chain. There we go. And now that I have removed a little bit of length, I'm going to go ahead and put my paper clip back on those 2 rings at the very end of the chain. And I'm going to take a new measurement just to make sure that it's just about the length that I want it to be. Now we're ready to weave our crystals into our chain. And we're going to start at the beginning end of our chain. And you don't want to have your clasp attached as you're adding the crystals. It makes your chain too heavy and a little unwieldy, and it will make crimping the ends of your beading wire much more difficult than it really needs to be. So the first thing that we're going to do is take our foot of beading wire, and I want to thread it through the very end single ring on my chain, and I want to make sure that I get it on the inside of this jump ring, meaning the side of the jump ring that's pointing towards the inside of the chain. So I'm going to actually kind of push it up so it exposes that side of the jump ring a little bit easier, and get your beading wire looped through that jump ring. And then I'm going to pick up one of my crimp beads. Okay, so now I've got my crimp bead on my beading wire, and I want to make sure that I get that crimp bead going over both ends of the beading wire so that it does create a little noose or a little loop around that jump ring. And I'm going to slide the crimp bead down pretty close and tight up on that jump ring. And you don't need a huge tail on your beading wire, just a little bit, enough to hold on to so that the loop doesn't slip out of that jump ring. Now if you have a crimping plier, go ahead and put it away. You're not going to need it for this. We're just going to use our chain nose pliers, and we're going to flat crimp this crimp bead. So you're going to take your chain nose pliers and just squeeze that crimp bead flat, make sure it's nice and tight. And then you want your cutters, whatever you're using to cut your beading wire, and you're just going to trim the short tail off of your beading wire as close to the crimp bead as possible. So now I have my beading wire attached to the jump ring on the end of my chain, and it's facing towards the inside of my chain. And now I want to get the end of my beading wire through, I want to weave it through so that it comes out the other side of my chain. As we're adding these crystals, we're going to be adding them from one side and the other, so we'll be weaving back and forth with our beading wire. And there is a space that is directly sort of a diamond-shaped space almost, and that's where I want to get the end of my beading wire. And slowly pull my beading wire all the way through to the other side of my chain. And I want to make sure, and this will be true throughout the entire weaving of the crystals, is I want my beading wire to come out in this little V created by these jump rings here. And I want it to come out, there's a ring that comes underneath that V. I want to make sure that the beading wire does not come underneath that ring, so it should just be coming straight out through that little V-shaped space, like so. Now, a lot of times what will happen once you get the beading wire pulled through to the other side of your chain is that sometimes this little loop of soft flex that you had so nicely tucked onto the inside of this jump ring here will kind of want to pop up sort of to the outside of the jump ring, and you don't want that to happen, because once you start weaving the crystals in, it can't really be fixed. And this is about what it's going to look like if it does do that. So see how it ends up out here? You don't want that if you can help it. So try and pay attention to that. And what causes that is the beading wire likes to twist as you're pulling it through, and it will twist and pop that loop out of position. So once you get the beading wire woven through, just go ahead and give it a nice solid tug and make sure that this loop of beading wire is sitting down in this space here, as opposed to out to the outer side of that jump ring. And flip your chain over to where your beading wire is coming out. And you're going to go ahead and thread a crystal. Again, these are 3mm bicone crystals. Use the bicones because they fit perfectly in the space provided between the jump rings. You can try and use round beads, 2.5 to 3mm round beads, but they tend to push the spaces open, and it kind of gives it, the beads don't sit down inside the chain as nicely as the little bicones do. But feel free to experiment. It just gives the chain a little bit different look. So now I've got my bead on the beading wire. I'm going to let it slide all the way down. And I'm going to kind of hold on to it. And I'm going to take the end of my beading wire and I want to thread it back down through to the other side of my chain. So I'm going to look for that little diamond or V-shaped space. Just going to poke it on down through there. And now I'm very gently going to feed my beading wire down through. I'm holding on to my crystal. What tends to happen if you don't hold on to it is that the beading wire wants to twist as you're pulling through, and if it does that, it will pop your beads back out to the outside of your chain once you're done, and if they do that, there's nothing you can do to fix it but redo the whole thing. So I'm very gently going to feed the beading wire through, and now I do not want to pull on the beading wire. If I pull too hard, I'm going to suck the bead down inside of the chain, and it's not a whole lot of fun to try and get it back out of there. So don't pull. You may give it a very gentle little tug just to seat the bead right in that space, and it should pop right into the space. I'm going to turn it over again. And once again, I want to check the position of my beading wire to make sure that it's coming out in this little V created by these two rings, but coming out up above this bisecting ring down here. If you can see that. Now I'm going to thread another crystal onto my beading wire. And let it slide down. Keep a hold of it. And look straight down and find that little space. Hold on to your crystal or guide your beading wire as you're pulling it through so that it doesn't twist. Like so. Again, don't pull. You really won't be happy if you pull too hard. So again, flip the chain over, check the orientation of the beading wire, and you're just going to continue adding crystals from one side and then the other until you reach the end of your chain. And I'm actually going to go ahead and give a nice hard tug on this next bead to show you what will happen if you do pull too hard on your beading wire. I'm also going to let it twist. So if I don't hold on to the beading wire or the bead, the beading wire will twist itself up and the bead will not sit properly. See, now it's a little cockeyed in there. It's not sitting the way that I want it to. So I'm going to pull on it to see if I can make it bend to my will, and now I've pulled it actually out to the other side of my chain, which I didn't want to do. So keep your little copper wire handy, because that will help to dig out any crystals that might go astray. Wow, did a number on that. Actually, on this one, I'm just gonna pull the beading wire, pull it off the beading wire, and get my wire back into the place where it belongs. And we'll try that again. I'm just going to continue on in this fashion, weaving down the length of my chain, moving back and forth from side to side. And again, if these rings are not behaving, just run your finger up along them. Make sure they're all pointing in the proper direction, which should be towards the beginning of your chain. Okay, so I have woven my beads into my chain up until the very end, and I tried really hard, but I was not able to pull any of these beads deep enough down into the chain to really show you how to get them back out. However, you probably will, especially if you're tugging on your chain or in your beading wire. And like I showed you earlier, just get in there with your copper wire or whatever you have and just dig. Again, you may have to spread the rings out wide to get your wire under there, but just get under there and pull that bead back up and out of the space, loosen it up, and then give it a very gentle tug to reseat it properly in that little space. Sometimes these beads will get pulled pretty far down inside the chain. It just takes a little bit more work to get them back out. So just be patient, take a deep breath. Okay, so now I have one more bead that will go in this very last space here on the end of my chain. Then I'm going to crimp off the other end of my beading wire. So here's my last bead. And I'm going to feed the beading wire back through to the other side of the chain. Again, don't let that beading wire twist as it's going through, because it will pop that bead right out of the chain. Usually after you've finished it, you don't always notice, so be attentive. And this last bead might be a little tricky. Don't let it get too far down. There we go. Okay, so now flip back over. I am going to take this paper clip off of the last two jump rings here on the end of my chain. I'm going to replace it with my copper wire. I want a straight wire for this because it's going to make your life so much easier to use a straight wire as opposed to something curved like a paper clip or a jump ring. So you're going to take your crimp bead, feed it onto the end of your beading wire, and let it drop down. Now here's the tricky part. You're going to want to loop your beading wire around the copper wire. Okay, finally. The biggest problem that I'm having here is the crimp bead is kind of sitting on top of the 3mm bicone below it. So I was having trouble actually poking the end of my beading wire through all the way through my crimp bead. But now I've done it, my wire is going to loop around the beading wire is going to loop around the copper wire. I'm going to go ahead and pull it fairly tight up against my copper wire. Spread these open. So now I've created a little loop. There's my crimp bead. And I'm going to take my chain nose pliers. Hope you can see that. Whichever way you can get those chain nose pliers in there, just get the tips of them in there around that crimp bead and squeeze it flat, like so. Okay. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove my wire. Everything should stay exactly where I left it. And I'm going to pick up an open jump ring, and I'm going to loop it through the jump ring on the end of my chain, through the little loop of beading wire, and out through the other jump ring. I have done this several different ways, and believe me, this is the easiest way to crimp off the other end of this beading wire, is to use the straight wire and then put the jump ring through. Now I'm just going to go ahead and close up this jump ring before I trim the tail of my beading wire and add my clasp. Okay, so there we have it. Now I want my cutters, whatever I'm using to cut my beading wire, find wherever the end of it is coming out and get in there with your cutters as close as you can and trim off that tail. Now this end bead, this very last bead that you put in, will want to seat itself a little deeper than you might want it to. So again, just get in there with your copper wire and kind of pull it up and out into its little space. And you can actually go ahead and do this after you get your clasp on, which will probably be a little bit easier. Now you're going to notice this ring here is not going to want to stay. It may momentarily where you put it, but it does have a tendency to kind of flip up. That is just the nature of the chain, because all these rings go in one direction and there's not a whole lot of tension here at the end of the chain. Plus you have a little bead down in there kind of pushing things around. This ring right here may want to flip up. Again, that's just what's going to happen, so hopefully you can live with that. And now that I have all my beads added, I'm going to go ahead and add my clasp. Okay, so now I'm ready to add my clasp, and again, because of the direction that the loops on my clasp are going, which are the same direction as the rings on the end of my chain, I'm going to need to add my clasp using another set of jump rings. If the loop on your clasp is going in the opposite direction of the rings on the end of your chain, you can just go ahead and attach it to these very end rings. Most clasps, however, will have the loops on them going in the same direction as the last ring on your chain, so you are going to need a couple of small jump rings to attach your clasp with. So I'm going to go ahead and hook that little jump ring on the very last ring on the end of my chain. Attach my clasp. And close that up. And I'm going to add a second little ring because I can. And again, this just adds a little bit of, oh, maybe I can't. Oh, yep, there it goes. This just adds a little bit of strength and stability to this end of the chain where you get a whole lot of wear and tear. Two rings are better than one. So this is a box clasp. Anytime you're using a box clasp, make sure that you keep both ends attached. as you attach it to your chain. Now I'm going to go ahead and take this other paper clip off. This will keep you, leaving the clasp attached to itself like this will keep you from misorienting, if that's a word, your clasp onto your chain, so you don't get the tongue of your box clasp upside down on one side. And one last ring. And there we go. So this, what you're looking at right here, this is actually the side of the chain with this little herringbone pattern going on. You can see the crystals shining through. And this is what it looks like from the top, or the bottom, looks the same. And keep in mind that you can use 2 different colors of crystals. You can use actually as many different color crystals as you like, but you can use one color on one side and a different color on the other side, or you can do sort of a little rainbow effect if you choose. Use your supply of crystals and your imagination to do this. So here are a few different samples of the crystal elf weave. This one is the one that we just did with the oxidized rings, which I have never actually used the oxidized rings before, and it's a nice effect. If you decide that you want to oxidize your piece, I would highly recommend that you oxidize your rings before you weave the crystals in, especially if you're using crystals with an AB finish on them, and you're using silver black or liver of sulfur. Either one will ruin the finish on your crystals. And these are all shiny, which is what I usually do, is use shiny rings. So here's a sample of an elf weave where I've used 2 different colors of crystal, a darker color on one side and then a lighter color on the other. And of course, use your imagination and your color palette of crystals that you have at home to decide what you want to do with that. This bracelet also has a toggle clasp on it as opposed to the box clasp. I recommend that you use either a toggle or a box clasp. I'm not really big on the lobster clasp for this bracelet, just because it tends to sit off to, it sits funny, just the way the rings on the end of this chain are oriented. The lobster clasp tends to sit strangely on this bracelet. So if you can stand using a toggle, which is nice to use if you have to put your bracelets on all by yourself, or a box clasp like that. And here I have used a little more of a extensive color palette on this bracelet, and then I just used a couple different colors on the other side. So have fun with this. Whatever you decide to do, there are many different possibilities. Well, I hope you had a good time making your crystal elf weave bracelet and that you've finished it and have a lovely new bracelet to wear. Just a couple of things I wanted to talk about before you leave here today. First thing, don't forget, don't pull on that beading wire. You don't want to tug those beads down into your chain unless you feel like taking a piece of copper wire and digging them back out again. So gently tug, do not pull on the beading wire. And the second thing I wanted to talk about was crimping the second crimp bead. In the video I used a copper wire to loop the soft flex around and feed the end of the soft flex back through the crimp bead. If that is proving problematic to you, look at your written handout, because there's a slight difference between the handout and the video, and it comes in step number 5 in adding the crystals. And it's where I've just simply taken the copper wire out of that step and I just loop the soft flex or the beading wire back through the crimp bead without having the copper wire in there, and then I put the copper wire in to tug the wire down and create a little loop before I crimp the bead. So try it either way. One way may work better for you than the other, but at least you have options to try. So I hope you had a good time, and see you next time.